Hi, and my name is David Wetton, and welcome to the Conscious Leadership Now podcast. The intent of this podcast is to encourage you as a leader to embrace conscious leadership by giving you access to some of the world's leaders in the field of conscious leadership, both in practice and in thought. And my heartfelt wish is that you leave this podcast feeling inspired with ideas to take away and implement in your business or organization to make a real difference in our world. And my guest today is Helena Clayton. Hi, Helena.
Good to be with you, Dave. Yeah, good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Lovely to have you. And Helena is a leadership and organizational development consultant and a coach with over 25 years of experience across all UK sectors. She designs and runs innovative leadership development programs that make a real difference for participants and their organizations. She is a coach, thinking partner, and a critical friend for leaders. She works with senior teams to help them work more effectively and have the conversations they don't normally have. And she is researching love, especially as it relates to leadership, with her Leading with Love, an award-winning research report with Roffey Park Institute. And as we go about the business of creating and encouraging change at this time, she asks what might happen if we put love at the heart of our practices. As well as a first degree, Helena holds a Master's in Leadership and Learning from Lancaster University and a postgraduate diploma in career consulting from Birkbeck. She is trained as a teacher of the Hoffman process, and she holds an ICF accredited coaching qualification. She began her career in operational and strategic HR with Dennis Publishing, Aon and Touche Roche. And she regularly returns to Roffey Park as part of their faculty for the MSc in People and Organisational Development. And she also works with London Business School as a Programme Director and with Maven Consulting. And Helena, I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say about leading from love and conscious leadership. And it's absolutely wonderful to have you on the show.
Thank you. Thank you.
So Take 5 by the Day Brubeck Quartet. That's my cue that it's time for you, Helena, to take 5, your take on 5 conscious leadership questions. So my first question is, what does conscious leadership mean to you?
So I first want to thank you for that track. My foot was tapping, and it's really lovely. And thanks for the question too, because in preparation for this, it really got me thinking. And I would have always said that consciousness equals awareness. And my take for a long, long time would be around leaders need to know themselves super well, and not just kind of strengths or gaps, but increasingly, I think, what matters to us as people and as leaders. You know, as a leader, what do I stand for? What matters to me? What line won't I cross? What's my moral take on something? And I'll talk more about that in a bit. But also, I think I see increasingly, especially in my coaching work, how important it is to be conscious of the parts of us, our shadow side, if you like, the parts of us that we don't like very much, we don't welcome in, we deny or push away. So there's something really strong for me about a conscious leader really is in tune with all of the parts that they are, all of the aspects of themselves they have inside them, and increasingly have a real clear sense of what they stand for in the world. So that's one thing, which is about self. Through also really understanding what matters to other people in the world, in their teams, in their organizations, in their friendship groups. But I think the thing that's really different for me now, which is why your question was so great, is something around leaders need to be conscious of their impact in the world. So what are the extended consequences, to use a phrase, of what they do in their leadership? How do the choices I make now in my team or function, or in my leading a cooperative group in my church, for example, how do those things create ripples in the world? And how can I really get a clear line of sight between what I'm doing now and the impact it has more widely? So, for example, and I think this may be very career limiting for me, I'm not sure yet, it's becoming increasingly not okay for me to do leadership development where the organization or their leaders are only focused on making the organization more effective or efficient or more well-run. It's becoming increasingly important that conscious leadership also asks us to try and work on some of the really difficult problems in the world, whether that's violence against women, climate. It almost doesn't matter, but there's something really growing in me about that's what consciousness means in leadership.
That's beautiful. So there's a real, isn't there? In my language, there's a real, being a real sort of purpose-led organisation. A purpose that's out to make a difference, really. As you said, whatever that might be. I'm going to ask you because one of the reasons I love having you on the podcast is around your leadership and love. I know one of the questions you're asking or working with, and it was in your Roffey Park paper. You're asking, should love be a core leadership competence? So I guess I'm asking, right. I'd like to ask, when you talk about conscious leadership, do you see love fitting in there as a core competence?
Well, I would say this, wouldn't I? But I so do. And I think what's been really interesting in the way I've explored love is, of course, when we think about what we mean by love, we mean care, compassion, empathy. Of course we do. That's right at the heart of it. And those things are sorely missing in many, many organizations. We hear so often about the sometimes brutal nature of working in an organization, even just benign neglect. Not all organizations, but many. So I think those aspects of love are sorely missing, but I think love means a lot more than that. So the latest blog piece I wrote was around love and anger, and how anger is such an important part of love because it gets us in touch with what matters to us. And if we can connect with what matters to us, we're more likely to protect it or do or stand for it. So anger connects us with what matters, which we protect, and that's a form of love. So I think it's, if we can look at love in a much more wide way, a much more multifaceted way, then yes, I can see really clearly that it's a core, essential part of leadership today.
It is, and I was actually fascinated to see that perhaps very wisely you didn't actually define love in your report. So I guess for conscious leaders saying, well, actually love is part of who I am, how I want to show up in this business, it wasn't actually defined. I mean, as you said, there were certain words that came out, such as you said, care, listening, empathy, compassion, these sort of things, which for me are part of conscious leadership. But as I said, the reason why this conversation I think is so important is, I think, as you said in the report, there was a large amount of being uncomfortable about speaking about love in leadership, in the workplace. So to me, it feels, to me, it makes sense. Love is part of conscious leadership. But what I think is really intriguing, what I love about your work, love, is this sense that actually you're bringing it into the conversation. For almost, it feels like people to explore, what does it mean for me? And it feels edgy, as I think you say in that report. But it's a paradox. It shouldn't really feel edgy because love is at the center of what we are and what we do. So this aspect of love and conscious leadership, I just think is just so important. I
agree. And there's a very juicy quote that I refer to in my research report. You'll have to be okay with swearing. I won't use it here. Yes. You'll have to look it up. By the actor Steve Coogan, who basically says, it's love that is the word that gets us our toes curling, or he talks about buttock clenching. And I really get that. So bringing love into the world of work, talking about it in organizations is tricky and difficult and problematic. And I totally see why it's not just a shoo-in. The actor Kenneth Williams said, love is the most awful invasion of privacy. So once we start taking that angle, you can absolutely see why it isn't a given in organizations, and we shouldn't just pour it in without thinking quite carefully about what it looks like in practice and what some of our boundaries might be.
Wonderful. And actually takes us on. I want to ask just a preliminary to the next question. So the next question is, how do you express conscious leadership through your work? And what I wanted to ask, I want to ask that question, but just to lead into that, I want to ask if there's, leaders who are listening to this podcast and this audio, YouTube, that are actually saying, do you know what, I'm curious about how I can explore embodying love in my conscious leadership in the workplace. What one thing would you say to them about, how do they go about introducing it? Because as you were just saying that, I don't know how to do it, Helena. How do I, if I'm in a meeting and it's my leadership team, how do I suddenly put love on the table?
It's a great question. And one of the ways I've been working with one client organization to do that is by sharing my research report. So circulating it and saying to people, what do you think about that? So you're not advocating for it necessarily. You're just saying, take a read of this. What do you think? Could there be something useful in this report, in this way of seeing things that could be useful to us? And what this organization is finding is that they're then having a conversation about that. That means they can kind of slide into a conversation about love for them and their team. So that's one way I might suggest.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. So back to the main thrust of the question. How do you express conscious leadership through your work?
One is actually sticking my head above the parapet and talking about love, because I think, as I referred to earlier, love is leadership is about prodding, poking, changing, provoking. I'm increasingly seeing love as leadership as activism. So I think in a tiny way, the fact that I'm just prodding this topic and introducing love into leadership is one way that I do that. All of my leadership programs, though, also spend a lot of time bringing the outside in, because when we work in organizations, our lens can become rather small, particularly if we've worked there for a long time or the organization is huge. We often feel we don't need to look elsewhere, and I don't think that's helpful or true. So I think I do a big piece of work about helping people learn from other places, not necessarily organizations, be introduced to people who are not like them. Just trying to bring new perspectives into the organization. It's said that the role of OD, or organizational development, is to bring into the system what the system is missing or lacking. So in part, that's one of the things I try and do, which I think is a conscious leadership act. And I think the other, sorry,
go on, carry on.
I think the other thing is that I try to model being a kind of warts and all facilitator or leadership development or coach. So just as I, at the top of the call, invited people to get to know their shadow, the parts of themselves that they don't like, I'm really open about some of those parts in myself. So I try and share as much of my broken bits or my vulnerabilities. Obviously, depends on the piece of work, but because I kind of want to role model an attempted wholeness when I can.
That's wonderful. I really respect that, and I think it was in your report I saw you referenced someone who the piece of work actually I've read recently, which I really liked, and that was the Fearless Organization by Amy Edmondson, right, where she talks about psychological safety. So this aspect where she defines it's where colleagues trust and respect each other and feel able, even obliged, to be candid or be vulnerable, if you like. And I think that's part of the elements here for me, this vulnerability. There's a number of things that come to the table, and there's just two quick things I wanted to say. One is around this aspect of, I think, being vulnerable around love and being willing to share that. And actually, do you know what? Something just came to me was, whatever word you may use around, whether it's, I talk about God, goddess, universe, truth, whatever people might refer to that. One of the sayings I always had is, and I shall use the word God, but there's the aspects of wherever you go, there God is. And of course, for a lot of the major faith traditions anyway, whatever their aspects of God is, it's really, God is love. So translate through, wherever you go, there love is. So what came to me is with this piece of work is, it's like you're saying you're bringing love into the workplace, but do you know what? My sense is it's always been there,
Right.
but it hasn't perhaps been named, as we said,
Right.
embodied, been given permission back to this psychological safety to actually have conversations around what does love in the workplace mean.
Spot on, David. Spot on. You know, there's an author, American feminist author called Bell Hooks,
Oh, yes.
and she says the world of work is a loveless place. And somebody once said to me, well, if it's true, as we were talking, we both believe that humans are hardwired for love. She quite rightly said, how can organizations be loveless if they're just made up of people who are hardwired for love? So I think it is very much, or very often, a case of just uncovering what's getting in our way to some extent. So yeah, I totally agree with you.
And if we're looking, I guess, just push the borders a little bit, this, more uncomfortable question for people, if you like, and I'll be vulnerable and say I've been in this position. I was in a major organization, it was a major accounting organization, where actually relationships between the staff were not encouraged. It wasn't far as it was allowed, but it was frowned upon. It was not allowed because we're being professional. We can't have that in the workplace. So how do you respond to those? Because obviously love does, from romantic love, can happen and flower in the workplace. It has for me, I know that. So where does this slot in? When people, what do you mean love in work? And do you mean romantic love? What part does that play in, leading with love?
So it doesn't play any part in the work I do. And I think one of the reasons I'm so interested in the word love and what it means is that it's become, for obvious reasons, very associated with sexual or romantic love, and religion and religious love, which clearly will be a draw for some, put off for others, but also sentimental, it has kind of sentimentality. And I'm really interested in seeing if we can find a way that we can talk about and embody love that is much more secular, robust, useful to us in the organization, and in a way that has very little connection with religion, sex, intimacy, romance. Yeah, I'm talking really about I suppose agape, the kind of love for human beings.
Yes.
Universal love. That's the territory I'm trying to play in, I think.
No, sorry, you mean yes? I don't not know. I really understand that, and I think we've spoken, before the call about that was one of the aspects Martin Luther King came from. He's very passionate about love, but from this particularly this agape aspect, and it was an important part of what he was doing to say that actually he was showing this love for all. Okay, he came from that faith, that Christian perspective, but I think what I sense is, particularly for your work as well, that this aspect of love, it carries a gravitas, it carries a depth with it, and it's almost, as you said, because you haven't defined it. To me, it's something like I think someone once said that actually they wrote a book on how not to name God. And what they meant by that is once you try and put God into words, he loses his essence. It's almost something like that around love, that once you kind of say love is definitely this, for some reasons you lose part of it for me, because as you said, it means different things to different people. You get a feeling for it, but it's almost at times very difficult to put into words.
Really. And I think it's the writer Charles Eisenstein says once we define something, we shear off any kind of nuance, really, and we box it and it becomes reductive. So yes, I know that it's tricky to talk about a piece of research without having a definition, but as yet I'm very much holding off from doing that for exactly that reason.
Yes, and it's similar actually to conscious leadership, my very first guest, who actually did name conscious leadership and give a definition of it, actually said to me, David, he used that word ineffable. It's not describable fully. So he said, it's only my definition. People have their own definitions around it. So I think this very much does apply to this. I think this final part on this embodied question around love, have you worked with any organizations where they've then taken some of this on board and have worked with it? Have you felt or seen some of the benefits where people perhaps even exploring, what does love mean for this organization?
So not with organisations. Interestingly, a number of projects exploring this were about to go live, really progress when the pandemic hit. So so many things have been put on hold. But I've run lots of workshops and events where we talk about this. And I really do see that once people can engage with the topic intellectually and kind of knock it around a bit, then we do some embodied work about what love can feel like between two people who don't know each other very well. And I really do notice how people get it, and can see how that can translate to the way they are with themselves, with their peers, with their colleagues, with their teams. So not at an organisational level yet, although I really do hope I get the chance to consult and work in organisations at some point soon. But yeah, I've definitely seen people shift as a result of the thinking and the embodied practices.
I think it's just a wonderful piece of work. And just as you were talking, we were talking about this aspect of psychological safety. I just got a sense actually of just that when people engage with this, there seems to be then, another word or another thing that people are engaging with, is emotional intelligence. Which is, how they relate to self, how they relate to others. So I just got a sense actually when people engage with this piece of work with you, that there's then a spaciousness that's generated that actually, as you said, if they're speaking about this, they're then able to perhaps name and talk about other things. It's perhaps a door opener into, so I'm just sensing, it has a ripple out effect maybe, that you might be speaking about love and someone might say, that the following week actually, I'm just picking, an example, might say actually, I don't know, might be speaking to a colleague and say, actually, I'm having trouble with my son and daughter at school, or whatever's going on, the sort of areas that perhaps traditionally we don't tend to bring into the workplace because we think, oh, that's outside. And maybe that's one thing this pandemic has helped, that people seeing the family on Zoom, whatever, is starting to bring, isn't that a family love into the workplace? I hadn't thought of that before. So,
and I love that point, that once we start talking about some things that we might have considered a bit taboo or difficult. Yes. I think that's right. It does encourage us or help us open the door to other, related difficult topics, so-called difficult. So yeah, I think it's generative in that sense.
So really, I mean, we're going a bit later onto your offerings, but I encourage people listening to this podcast to connect with you and engage in this, because my sense is that it's not, uncomfortable is a word that came out and people, how do we speak about love? But just speaking to you, just say, well, Helena's someone who can hold this space for you and start a conversation going. So, that's my sense. So if you are an exemplar in this area, my next question is, who for you is an exemplar of embodied conscious leadership and why?
And this is interesting. Because I found myself not being able to name organizational leaders. And I think, and again, this is an emerging thought, it's like actually in organizations, most people are senior managers. If we go to my definition of leaders being agitators and provokers and moving things on. But I did come to people like, from these times we're in now, people like Marcus Rashford, the footballer who used his experience, used his voice, pushed for something, was vocal and created change. For me, that's great leadership. I also think of an extraordinary woman called Jack Monroe, who started life as a blogger, writing about how you can feed herself and her small son on, tuppence a day. She now has an extraordinary following, is really influential, as well as doing amazing work in the world. So it's people in the community, regular people, if you see what I mean, and not in organisations that first came to mind. And I thought of Extinction Rebellion and people like Gail Bradbrook. This again, what matters to us? How can we do something about that? So yeah, they're very much. That's where I'm looking at leadership in terms of conscious leadership. Today, anyway. Ask me next week; they might be slightly different, but today, that's where I go.
But thank you for bringing those people into the conversation, because You're right, and I hadn't thought about it before, but quite often, because we're thinking conscious leadership, people can quite often think about, there are leaders in the business perspective, organizational perspective, but, as one of my guests said on the show, we all have the capability to be a conscious leader.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be in that big organization. So actually naming someone or that have actually stepped in and done something, I think it's two things. One, we can all be a conscious leader. And the second thing I think that's important is to bring in our leadership, our conscious leadership, we can bring in examples from other areas that come in, actually we can learn from. Because again, I think, I'm going to just call it traditional leadership.
Yeah.
It can be, we draw on traditional things. And there's nothing inverted commas wrong with that, but I think my sense is there's a lot to be learned from other areas which we can bring them in, and as long as they resonate, they can have a tremendous impact on the organization.
Really. And I think increasingly now I talk less about leadership and more about acts of leadership, which implies that it speaks for itself, and those are what matters more, I think, these days.
It is. And the second part of this question, in your journey with this, what resources have you personally found helpful?
I struggled with this because I read a huge amount and wasn't sure what kind of to share, but what came to mind is a TED talk, and I'm sure we'll share the link, by a Sikh activist, an American Sikh activist in the States called Valerie Kaur. And her TED talk, new book actually, is called Revolutionary Love. And on the one hand, she's a firebrand. She's extraordinarily powerful, but her work is based on what I've come to call radical acceptance. It's about no matter what the other person is like or has done, she says yes to it. She welcomes it. And from a place of radical acceptance, she then leads from love. So I would encourage people to look at her TED talk. It's super powerful. And I haven't yet bought her book, and this is making me commit to doing that this week.
Wonderful, thank you. I do believe actually I've seen that TED talk, which is a wonderful TED talk. And so really I think there's lots of great resources, I think, from TED and other things that are now available to us. We're living in a very rich time. And when you were just talking about radical acceptance, something that came into my mind, and I don't know if you've come across it or not, there's an author called David Richo, Richo, How to Be an Adult in Relationships. And the reason I'm bringing him into the equation is that, interesting enough, because I just thought of it, because he has his 5 A's. So he talks about attention, you show people attention. Then there's acceptance, actually, this radical acceptance of someone's in front of you. That actually then there's appreciation that's shown for the other. Interesting enough, there's affection, which is love in there. So that's interesting. And then the last one is allowing, how you then allow people. And again, I bring him into the room in this conversation because I just get a sense that he also has, I think working with those also bring this same sense of spaciousness into the conversation. And I've used some of those in some of the work I've done. I know, just as you were speaking about having a conversation about love, having a conversation about these areas has suddenly opened up deeper conversations. So as an example, I worked with 2 leaders who we were sharing, like you would share about love, I was sharing about the acceptance, or I was sharing the 5 A's. And they had this conversation. They said at the end of it, David, we learned things about each other we never knew as colleagues. And we feel it's deepened our relationship as working colleagues. And that really moved me. So I sense this as well. I want to bring this into the room to say, you must have felt that as well. It's a privilege, I think, to lead in those areas and be part of that. And so I want to honour the work that you do through that.
And thanks for bringing him in. He has a book called The Past is Present, which is also a great read. And I'd forgotten about his 5 A's. And I'm now kind of going, wow, of course. So thank you. I'm going to reread and dig those out. That's super helpful. Thank you.
Yes, I had the privilege of meeting him actually in San Francisco. And he said, bless him, he actually said that the 5 A's he felt was the book he was here to write.
I can believe that.
So, but here's another, and this is why I'm just going to use the word heartfelt. I think, like yourself, he's a real heartfelt person who's really here to to make a difference in the world. You spoke about I want to work with organisations that
Mm.
want to make a difference, and I think it's a sheer joy to actually to interview a number of people on this podcast, because I sense, like yourself, you're here to actually help organisations make a difference by being there.
Mm.
And there's something making a difference. There's something different about this, in a sense of this openness, this love, peace, joy, this resonance. So thank you. Now, my next question is research by its Professor Jody Fry at Texas A&M University, which I think is unusual to see at the university in Texas talking about inner life, but his research, and I think it's almost now 20 years, and Jody again is someone that I've met, and his research suggests that inner life is a source of conscious leadership, where inner life is a form of spiritual or contemplative practice, or it could be a reflective practice, it could be walking nature, it could be meditation, it could be whatever. So I wanted to ask you, in your journey, what practices have you found helpful, and why?
So they fall into two buckets. One, as a raging introvert, is a bucket that's all about spending quiet time, silence, stillness, time on my own. So I have a meditation practice. I walk a lot, the kind of left, right. You know, it really is, I find very soothing and is great for thinking. And I love spending time on my own. I'm very easily kind of overstimulated, so I need to let things settle. So that for me allows me to connect to spirit, to connect with what matters, to connect with something more than the kind of day-to-day stuff. But I think the other thing that really helps me with my spiritual practice, my consciousness, is doing from time to time some fairly deep dive, immersive personal growth workshops. And there have been plenty. An organisation called Celebration of Being, the Hoffman process, shadow work. So from time to time I dive deep, because those are the things that really help me stay clean, I think, to do my work. So those two buckets, which are so different but so both important to me.
And do you find that those practices then help you become more present with your work, if that makes sense?
Hugely. Partly, you know, when I coach especially, part of the job is getting out of the client's way. And through those practices, I create a clear space where I mean, you can't get yourself totally out of the way, but where I'm less in the way. And I think that's a responsibility of being a coach, for example. So yes, I think it makes a massive difference to my practice.
And how do you relate to, because I think I saw it in your report again, and we were talking about the shadow side, which I think is important. And we know, because we all have them, you know, the what they call ACE, but the adverse childhood experiences. So, you know, just if you're working with a group, or you might even be an individual, and these, you know, because love is perhaps one of those areas that can actually bring up the shadow side, these adverse childhood experiences. So what do you say to leaders, you know, because perhaps some leaders, myself included, might be a little fearful in going into the space, because I think you then write about love and fear. I know that as well. So if they're fearful about, well, if I step into this, I may bring up shadow, I might bring up adverse childhood experiences. How can I manage this so that so it remains a safe, held space?
So my work is definitely not therapeutic, and I know my boundaries, so I don't go certain places. But what I do increasingly now, even on so-called traditional leadership programs, I will bring in the notion of adverse childhood experiences, the idea of slow trauma. And I'll give examples from the research, but also from my own life, to show people that if they recognize anything in their own experience, it's normal. You know, the research says between 40 and 60% of us are walking around with some kind of unfinished business from slow trauma, which could be anything as, inverted commas, regular as poverty or economic hardship, divorce, right through to abuse and trauma. And so often when I talk about this to people, you can see people go, oh my word, that's me, and that's normal, and you share the same experience, and wow, half of that is so normalizing. It's extraordinary. So probably the closest I go is to just inform people, I think, that that most of us are carrying stuff from our early years. Yeah.
Thank you, and I really appreciate that answer. And it's very similar, actually, because when I met with David Rico, you know, we're talking about the 5As, I did ask him a similar question. Because
Yeah,
I said, well, I'm a sort of ordained interfaith minister. I have experience in spiritual counselling, but like you said, I'm not going to go into the therapy aspect. If there's, I said, how will I know that it's, you know, that it's reasonable? You know, how will I know when to refer? And he just smiled and said, David, you will know. You'll have a sense of knowing. So he just said, trust that.
Yeah.
So. So I think that's it's important, I think, to raise. And I like the aspect you say that actually sometimes that shared experience around that, not feeling shame, blame, or awful, just actually knowing actually this is a normal thing, and actually, and it's irrespective perhaps sometimes of the, you know, the parenting or the caregiving we might have had when we were younger. It's that actually a lot of people have these experiences. So that aspect of conscious leadership, bringing out and saying, you know, there's aware on that, and it's bring some normality. That itself may just be helpful, because that's almost a first step then, isn't it, into how can I then perhaps look or choose to work with some of the shadow work.
And at the start of a long program like the MSc, actually, at Roffey Park, because we're working together for 2 years, the first thing we do as a group, as a learning set, is do our lifelines, our timelines.
Yes.
And we say, what, you know, handful of things have shaped you to become the person you are today, and go right back to the beginning. And people can choose what they talk about. But what I see time and time again is, given the opportunity, people choose to say, this was an awful time, or this happened in my background or childhood, and this is how it shapes me. And again, it's just bringing it in and normalizing it, and it creates incredibly strong connections amongst the group, because there's so much shared experience. You know, oh, you had that happen to you, I did too, or something very similar. So it's extraordinary, actually, the impact that can have on connection between people.
It does, doesn't it? And I think it's another sort of theme that has gone through these podcasts is actually the power of story, the power of personal story, how much we enjoy hearing it. And I think in my work, as you said, when people have shared these personal stories and sometimes have taken the courage to be safely vulnerable for them in what they're sharing, as you said, they realize other people have had similar or other sorts of experiences. And actually, when that is, you said, you're brought into the room, there's almost is, you know, it's not audible, there's a collective side to go, actually, this is okay to share this. And as you said, there is definitely then some sort of bonding that goes on from a sense of building, I think, trust, and a sense of then togetherness, because I think this human experience is we are together. I would say we're together in love, but it's part of that aspect of being human. And maybe you've got me really thinking that actually, you know, in the classical, you know, and I got an MBA and did it wherever it was 25 years ago, that we're taught all these great tools and processes, but very little on the human interaction side of things around how we, as you said, how we might be looking at leading with love. And I believe more's coming in now, thank goodness. But perhaps that's where we've almost, if you think about it, that's where we've split off, maybe, haven't we? That's our experience at home or with our colleagues, with our friends. This is our experience in the workplace. Whereas I can see your work, you know, you're talking about leading with love, you're bringing it gently back in again and saying, actually, as we said earlier in the conversation, guess what? It was always here. We're now actually naming it, and we're having the courage to bring it in.
Yeah, in a tiny way. You never know, it might make a tiny bit of difference to somebody somewhere. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. So I'm really, you know, inspired to see, you know, what happens with your program and where your work goes. And talking of next, I have my question that says, finally, given unlimited time and resources, what single thing would you recommend aspiring conscious leaders to do?
So it's do your own inner work. So just as we would go to the gym or run, you know, as a lifetime's way of keeping fit, for me, I think in parallel we need a separate track about doing our inner work. Now that could mean therapy and deep dive stuff, but as a minimum, I think it's get yourself a coach so that you can really protect time to reflect and think about who you are, what matters, how you show up in the world. So protect time to do your inner work. in whatever way works for you would be my thing.
I love that. I just had that glimpse of actually, leaders or anyone, but let's stay with leaders, committed to doing that inner work. And then actually bringing that, if you're in there doing, leading with love, bringing that into the conversation as well would be so powerful, because it's back to, again, isn't it? And it seems to be a theme in this particular conversation that actually, once you bring love into the conversation, actually you're bringing all of your life into the conversation, into work.
Right. Right.
And that, Helena, was part of my journey into spirituality in the workplace, conscious leadership, where I read an article where someone said, actually, I'm tired of coming to work, putting my jacket on the peg. It was a guy, being someone who I'm supposed to be in work, finishing my working day, putting my jacket on and being someone else at home and in my work, in my community and with my friends. And he just said, actually, I just want to be authentic wherever I am.
Right.
So
that's right. And I'm that gets a thumbs up, and always recognizing that people have to have complete choice about how much of themselves they bring to work. For some, it's just simply not okay or safe or acceptable to do that, and that always has to be okay for people too.
Thank you. And that probably ties into, before I go into my Columbo question, I have one more final question. I have one question just before that. So actually, because you just raised a very good issue, so thank you. So what do you say to those leaders who maybe ask the question, really love your work, Helena, I'm interested in doing it. How do I compassionately deal with those that say, I'm not interested, don't want to have a conversation about love in the workplace, not interested?
You say fine at some level. And then there are many people who might post, when I post something on LinkedIn, will let me know that it is just simply not okay for me to be initiating these conversations, that love categorically does not belong at work. And my response is, I hear you. For you, that is totally true, and I would never try and persuade you otherwise. So yes, it's to say totally fine. Totally fine.
Thank you for that. So that really means to me that actually with this work, all are welcome, and all are welcome with their choices. Whether that's a choice to say, I choose not to engage with this, that's as valid as someone saying, yippee, I just want to jump in with both feet. You know what I mean? And I think that's to be honoured, I think, because we're all on a journey with that. So my Columbo, my just one more thing question is one around, please, we've talked about your programme and the paper you did with Roffey Park, but please share your own resources and offering you feel would be useful to those who are listening and watching this podcast.
So thanks for the opportunity to say this. So I would just direct you to my website, I guess, which is helenaclayton.co.uk. And there you'll find my broad leadership stuff, but also the research report that David mentions will be on the Leading from Love page. Also, there is a new program that's just starting, which is a small action research group coaching program for leaders looking to explore how they bring love into their leadership. Also, my blog page is full of articles and pieces, mostly exploring, love and other things. And then you can also sign up to my newsletter there if those kind of things take your fancy. So yes, I direct you straight to my website, I think. Oh, I'm on Twitter, clearly, and LinkedIn. So find me anywhere. Yes. But the first place is probably the website for ease.
Okay, thank you, Helen. And I'll put a link below. And I'll put a separate link as well into the paper, because I think that's important. Leadership and love, that's important for people to have a read of that. So Helena, thank you so much for being on the show and really for showing up in this world of conscious leadership in the inspiring way that you do with love. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, and great to have this conversation, and it's made me think slightly differently about a few things, so it's been really helpful to me too. So
and me also, and I hope as well for those that have listened. So thank you.
Great.
So I want to say, actually, for those that are listening and watching, if you've enjoyed this podcast and my approach to conscious leadership, then please know I help aspiring conscious leaders develop purpose-led, high-performing leadership teams through one-to-one coaching and tailored leadership programs. And if you sense that I can help you, then please look me up on LinkedIn. That's David Wetton, and let's jump onto a conversation together. Before we go, I just want to say thank you to your bird, actually, for really serenading us through this through this journey, and I've loved listening to him or her.
He's a chatty little thing all day, yeah.
So finally, I just wanted to thank you, all the listeners to this podcast. And if you're willing, please do share a link to this podcast with those you think would truly benefit from it. Because I truly believe that now is the time for conscious leadership. And with all the inspiring, heartfelt work you as listeners are doing, I have no doubt that conscious leadership will become a thriving reality, making a difference for the greater good of all. So until next time, I'll leave you with a blessing from John O'Donoghue. May the light of your soul bless the work you do with the secret love and warmth of your heart. And so it is.